My name is Delaney Sinclair. I'm 29 years old, and I know exactly what it feels like to sit at a table where everyone already knows what's coming except you. It was Easter Sunday, the kind of gray April afternoon that Ontario specializes in, where the snow has finally gone but the cold hasn't decided to leave yet. We were at the Vautrin House in Cambridge, the big stone place on Ellis Road my mother-in-law Noelle had owned for 32 years. I'd driven 40 minutes from Kitchener, with a lemon tart in my lap, because Noelle had asked me to bring something, and I'd spent 2 hours making it from scratch because I was still, at that point, trying. 12 of us at the table. My husband Miles was at the far end, talking to his uncle. I was beside my father-in-law Bernard, who smiled at me the way he always had, kindly, carefully, like a man who knew something he wasn't allowed to say. Noelle sat at the head of the table. She waited until the plates were mostly cleared before she stood up and tapped her glass with a spoon. She said she had a few things to share, that the family business was entering an exciting new chapter, that Amber, Miles's younger sister, 26 years old, who had never managed so much as a bank account without help, was being brought in as co-director of Vautrin Fine Catering, and that, going forward, the business would be restructured to keep everything within the immediate family core. Then she looked at me just briefly, the way you look at furniture you've decided to donate. She sat back down and picked up her fork. I didn't cry. I didn't raise my voice. I reached across the table for the wine, and I poured myself a glass, and I said very quietly, "Before we finalize anything, I'd like to understand what that means for the $45,000 I put in." Noelle smiled. "That was always a personal loan, Delaney. It was repaid." "When?" I asked. She looked at Miles. Miles looked at his plate. That was the first moment I understood I was not at a family dinner. I was at the closing of something. They had already decided. The documents were probably already drafted. I was the last person at the table to know. If you've ever sat in a room where everyone had already written your ending without telling you, drop a comment and let me know what city and time you're listening from. I read every single one. I finished my wine. I helped clear the plates. I drove home alone because Miles said he needed to stay and talk through some things with his mother. He texted once, "Home late, don't wait up." I sat in our kitchen until almost midnight with the lights off. I didn't sleep. I just sat there, thinking about lemon tarts. To understand why I didn't fight back right away, you need to understand what I was standing on, and how carefully it had been hollowed out. I met Miles in the summer of 2020, when the world was slowly opening back up, and everyone was behaving a little recklessly with optimism. I was working as a mortgage administrator at a brokerage in Waterloo. That's a job that means I live inside documents, loan agreements, title searches, discharge statements, consent forms. I know exactly what a signature is worth and what it costs when you sign something without reading it. Miles was warm and funny and had the kind of laugh that filled up a room. His mother Noelle was sharp and capable, running Vautrin Fine Catering with the efficiency of someone who had built something real from nothing. His father Bernard was quiet and kind. I liked all of them. I was so relieved to have a family that felt uncomplicated. I had spent years being the capable one in my own, the daughter who handled things, who showed up with soup, who paid for her own birthday dinner because it was easier than asking. Vautrin Fine Catering had been running 28 years, corporate events, weddings, occasional film productions. But by 2021, COVID had gutted the events industry and they were carrying serious debt. Miles asked if I could help bridge the gap until bookings came back. He said it would be documented. He said I'd be listed as a business partner in writing. I transferred $45,000, every cent of my TFSA. I know how that sounds. But Miles and I were planning to get married, and I thought I was investing in what we were building together. We married in the spring of 2022. Small ceremony. I paid for most of it, the same way I'd paid for most of our furniture, our deposit on the rental in Kitchener, the long weekends to visit his family. Miles was excellent at being present and not very consistent at being prepared. I told myself those things balanced out. After the wedding, I asked about the partnership documents twice. Miles said his mother was handling it. I asked Noelle directly once, in early 2023. She said it was with the accountant, almost done. I let it go. The way you let go of things you're afraid to push too hard on when you want to believe everyone means well. Here's what I understand now. I was a forensic mind who spent every workday catching financial discrepancies in other people's files, and I never once asked to look at the books of the business that had my money in it. You don't audit the people you love. That was the vulnerability they were counting on. What I should have noticed and didn't is that I was never once in the room when decisions were made. Miles summarized meetings to me afterward. Noelle asked me to help set up events, as staff, never as an owner. And in September of last year, Amber was added to the business email chain while I was quietly removed. That was the ground I was standing on. Solid, I thought. I didn't know anyone had been digging under it for months. Easter Monday, I played the voicemail again. It had come in at 7:43 in the morning on our home phone, the landline we kept because Bernard preferred to call that way. When it rang that morning, I was in the shower, and I'd listened to it quickly after. Miles's voice, upbeat, something about all good for today. I assumed he was confirming our arrival time. Sitting at my kitchen table the next morning with bad coffee and 3 hours of sleep, I played it again from the beginning. His voice was different from what I'd registered, not upbeat, warm, the particular warmth that isn't meant for a conversation about Easter turkey. It's me. Tonight went as planned. She didn't push back. I was surprised, honestly. Once you're listed properly, the rest should move fast. We just need her to sign off on the consent before she starts asking the right questions. Don't say anything to Mum today, let her have her moment. Call me tonight, love you. I sat with that for a long time. The call display showed Miles's cell, and I scrolled back and found a voicemail from 2 weeks earlier that I'd assumed was a misdial. I'll be at your place by 7. Don't tell her about the cottage. Amber's name sits directly above mine in his phone. One tap too high, and a man who'd spent months quietly erasing me had sent his confession to the wrong woman twice. I did not call him. I got in my car. The Vautron cottage outside Elora had always been described as a family asset that would eventually pass to Miles and Amber together. Miles had mentioned it the previous fall. Mum wants to put it in the right hands before she gets older. I'd nodded. I hadn't understood I was not among those hands. There was a contractor's truck in the cottage driveway when I pulled up. A man was installing a new dock section, and when I asked who'd arranged the work, he wiped his hands and said, "The young couple, Miles and Amber." Said they're taking the place over once the paperwork clears. I thanked him and walked back to my car and sat with my hands on the wheel, staring at the lake. Miles and Amber. I want to tell you I felt rage. What I felt was colder, more useful. It was the feeling I get at work when two numbers in the same file refuse to agree, when the account of events and the documentary record are quietly pointing at each other across the page. There's paper somewhere, I thought. There's always paper. I drove home and opened my laptop. If you were standing in that driveway watching strangers install a dock on your family's cottage, would you have gone home and let it be Easter Monday? Or would you have started pulling threads? Tell me in the comments what you would have done. Stay with me, because what I found under the first thread was worse than an affair. Ontario property records are public. I paid the search fee and typed in the Elora address. A transfer of beneficial interest had been registered in February, 2 months before Easter dinner, before Noelle's announcement, before any conversation with me. The transfer named Miles and Amber as joint beneficial owners. I checked the Ontario Business Registry next. In November, Amber had been added as a corporate officer. My name, which I had been told for 2 years was being formalized, did not appear anywhere in the filing. And there was an amendment to the shareholders' agreement, dated December, that I had never seen. Which meant either my signature had been forged, or the amendment had been structured so it didn't require me. I remembered the consent form. 8 months ago, Noelle had handed me a stack of documents at the end of a family dinner. She said it was routine paperwork for the business insurance renewal, and she'd flagged 3 places with sticky tabs. I was tired. Miles said the accountant needed it before month's end. I trusted him. I signed. I kept copies. Professional habit. I dug them out and read what I'd actually signed. It was a consent to a change in corporate structure. I had signed away my interest in the business. The language was technical enough that you'd have to be looking for it to find it, and warm enough in the preamble that someone being handed it at the end of a family dinner would see insurance and stop reading. I put the documents on my kitchen table, and I was honest with myself about the next hour, because I don't want to pretend I was calm the whole way through. I cried. I sat on my bathroom floor. I ate peanut butter out of the jar with a spoon. The part that came after, the part where I was precise, didn't come from strength. It came from whatever's left after you've finished falling apart. Then I called Maura. Maura had been my closest friend since university and does not panic. She said, "Okay, what do you actually have?" I told her everything. She was quiet for a moment. "Don't call Miles," she said. "Not yet. The second he knows you're looking, they'll move whatever they still need you to sign." She was right. The only advantage I had was that they thought I'd sat quietly through Easter dinner and accepted it. I kept that advantage. I spent the following week doing the thing I'm best at, which is reading documents carefully enough to find what's wrong with them. The consent form issue was about fraudulent misrepresentation. I'd been told I was signing one thing while being handed another. Under Ontario law, that has implications. But I needed more than one document. I needed the pattern. I found Gordon Charest through an old company directory I still had from my brief time on the Vautrin Fine Catering email chain. Gordon had been their bookkeeper for 11 years. He'd retired at the end of last year, and Miles had mentioned it once, casually. Good timing. Things are changing anyway. That sentence had meant nothing to me at the time. I texted Gordon and said I was trying to understand some things about the business. He didn't reply for 2 days. Then, not by phone. "Can you come to Guelph?" He was already at the coffee shop when I arrived, sitting with a green tea and a closed expression. The first thing he said was, "I left because I was asked to do things I couldn't do." He turned his mug a quarter rotation, then another. "Your loan came up in the fall," he said. "I was given a reclassification instruction. They wanted it listed as a shareholder loan, repaid. But there was no actual transfer, no bank record, just a category change in the ledger." I asked who had authorized it. "It came through Miles," he said. "But Miles doesn't make those decisions. He never has." He slid a folder across the table. Inside was the ledger page with my $45,000 reclassified as loan repaid. SH agreement amendment. No transaction date, no corresponding entry anywhere. Someone had simply changed the word and trusted I would never look. At the bottom of the reclassification instruction, 2 initials. NV. Noelle Vautrin. I'd been aiming at Amber this entire time, the loudest person in the room. And the loudest person is almost never the one running it. Gordon's folder gave me the structure, but it left me with a question I hadn't let myself look at directly. If Noelle had done this to me, had she done it before? Bernard had once said, very carefully, on the only occasion I'd ever asked about family history, "Noelle has always known how to protect the business," and Miles had mentioned an aunt once, years back in passing, someone who'd left the family before he was old enough to understand why. When I asked, he'd change the subject in that particular way. That meant the subject wasn't available. I called Bernard. He answered on the first ring. "I need to know about Claudette," I said. Long pause. "How much do you know?" he asked. "Only her name," I said. "No," he said, "he wouldn't have told you more." Claudette was Noelle's younger sister. She had been a founding partner in Vautrin Fine Catering, not a silent one, an operational one. She'd built the first client relationships, worked the early events out of a rented commercial kitchen in Hamilton. Then, in the mid-90s, Noelle had handed her a restructuring document and described it as a tax formality. Claudette had signed. By the time she understood what she'd given up, her ownership interest was zero, the filing was done, and the story had already been written. Claudette was difficult. Claudette had chosen to leave. Claudette had never really committed. Bernard gave me her number. I always thought, he said quietly, that it would happen again, I just never knew to who. Claudette lived outside of Hamilton. She opened the door before I had a chance to knock, and she looked at me the way someone looks at a letter they've been expecting for a very long time. "Come in," she said, "I made tea." She told me about the document she'd signed in 1996, the language it had used. The way Noelle had stood over her while she read it, filling the room with cheerful conversation so Claudette's eyes couldn't settle on the page. "She does that," Claudette said. "She fills the room with other things so you don't read carefully." I told her about the insurance renewal form. She nodded slowly. "And the money?" she asked. I told her about the $45,000, the ledger reclassification. She closed her eyes for a moment. "She did that to me too, smaller amounts, same method, just change the word." "I always wondered if she'd do it again," Claudette said after a while. "I assumed it would be Amber. Amber seemed next. I didn't think she'd use Miles to do it. That's crueler than what she did to me." She looked at her hands. "Because a bad business document is one thing. A bad husband is something you carry differently." I already knew that, I just hadn't said it out loud yet. By mid-May, I had everything laid on my dining room table, organized not in the order I'd found it, but in the order it would land. The reclassification ledger, my bank records showing the $45,000 had gone out and never returned. The consent form I'd signed under false description, with a legal summary from Deborah Fung at a firm in Guelph that used the phrase fraudulent misrepresentation 3 times. The corporate amendment removing my name. The Alora property transfer. The voicemail, transcribed and timestamped. Gordon's written statement. Claudette's written account of 1996. I had retained Deborah Fung 2 weeks into my investigation, and she had looked at everything with the careful attention of a woman who does not like it when the law is used as a costume for theft. She told me not to say a word until she'd reviewed the full picture, and then she called me back and said, "They needed one more signature from you." That's what all of this was building toward. The consent form I'd signed had been broad but not complete. For the business restructuring to be fully enforceable, and for the matrimonial property angles related to the cottage to be resolved cleanly, they needed me to sign a formal release. That's what the Easter dinner announcement had been. Not the closing act, the opening pressure. Shake me with the news, let me sit with it for a few weeks. Then call me to a signing dinner and hand me a pen while I was still processing. I had not been confronted at Easter. I had been softened. I wasn't soft anymore. On a Tuesday evening, a group text arrived from Noelle. "Family dinner Saturday. We want to get the paperwork done and move forward together. Please come, Delaney. Let's end this well." I typed back one word. "Okay." Maura drove me. She waited in the car with 2 Tim Hortons coffees and the particular patience of someone who already knows the outcome is handled. The Ellis Road dining room had been set formally. Noelle only did that when she needed the room to do the work for her. Flowers, a folder at my place, a woman in a dark blazer I didn't recognize, introduced as a notary there to handle the signing. Miles sat to his mother's left. He wouldn't look at me directly. Amber sat across from him, composed in a way that cost her something visible. Bernard was at the far end of the table, turning his fork over and over in his hands. Noelle thanked everyone for coming. She said the goal was simply to clarify the structure and make sure everyone moved forward well. She slid the folder toward me. I set my hands flat on the table. Before I look at anything, I said, I want to make sure I understand the family's position. So everyone is clear on what we're agreeing to. I turned to Noelle. The $45,000 I transferred in 2021 was repaid in full, and my involvement in the business was always informal, no ownership interest. Is that this family's position? Noelle folded her hands. The loan was repaid through the shareholder adjustment. It's reflected in the records. Which records? I asked. Silence. I opened my bag. I placed Gordon's ledger page on the table first. This is the reclassification. There is no corresponding bank entry, no transfer, no receipt. The word changed. The money didn't move. I put my bank statements beside it. 45 months of them, every deposit accounted for, no return of $45,000 in any form. The notary's pen had gone still. The consent form I signed in August. I laid it on the table. I was told it was for business insurance renewal. Here is what it actually says. I placed the legal summary beside it. Deborah Fung at Fung Appellate in Guelph reviewed the document. She uses the term fraudulent misrepresentation. I've also initiated a complaint with the Law Society regarding whoever drafted it. Amber's hands moved to her lap. The corporate amendment that removed my name. I laid it down. Under the Ontario Business Corporations Act, a shareholder whose interest is being reduced to zero is entitled to notice and consent. The consent I supposedly gave was obtained under a false description of the document's purpose. I looked at the notary directly. I don't know whether you've reviewed the underlying documents. You may want to do that before certifying anything tonight. The notary closed the folder she'd been holding. She did it slowly. She did not open it again. And this. I placed the voicemail transcript on the table and read it aloud, evenly. We just need her to sign off on the consent before she starts asking the right questions. I let that sit. I had the right questions, I said. I just asked them 6 months later than you needed me to. Miles was staring at the tablecloth. I turned to him, not to wound him, because that would have been about me, and this wasn't about me anymore. I loved you, I said. I want you to know I understand the difference between what we were and what this is. I'm not confused about that. He didn't answer. That was its own kind of answer. Noelle drew herself up and reached for the warm, authoritative voice, the one that had run 3 decades of events and closed 100 rooms before they could become arguments. Delaney, she began, if we could all just. Claudette sends her regards, I said. The room went very quiet, not the polite quiet of a family dinner, something else. Bernard set his fork down. The notary stood, gathered her briefcase, and said to Noelle very calmly that she wasn't able to proceed on these documents, that the parties should each retain independent counsel before scheduling anything further, and that she was sorry to have to leave early. She was out the door in under 5 minutes. I stood up. The $45,000 will be addressed through Deborah's office, I said. The business can restructure however you'd like. I have no interest in fighting for a seat at this table, but my investment was never a gift. It is a debt, and it will be treated as one. I picked up my folder. I've also filed for a declaration of interest on the Elora property. Matrimonial property law in Ontario is quite clear about verbal representations made in the presence of witnesses. Bernard heard the cottage discussion at Christmas 2022. He's prepared to confirm that. Bernard was looking at the window. He did not look at Noelle. I walked out the same door Noelle had once opened to welcome me into this family, and I did not look back. Maura was at the curb with the engine running, and a question she decided not to ask. Drive, I said. She drove. The months after were quieter and more thorough than any explosion. Deborah's office reached a settlement on the $45,000 before the end of summer. Full repayment. No admission of wrongdoing on paper, but no confidentiality clause either. I was permitted to decline that, and I did. The complaint regarding the consent form worked its way through a process I wasn't required to manage personally. Miles moved out in June. The apartment we'd shared for 3 years was divided the way things get divided when a marriage was also a financial arrangement, carefully, with paperwork, without much feeling left to spend on the furniture. Votron Fine Catering lost 3 long-standing corporate clients in the fall. In a business that runs on reputation and word of mouth, the kind of story that came out of that Easter dinner travels faster than any press release. Gordon had spent 11 years building relationships with the vendors and suppliers who quietly took their recommendations elsewhere. I won't tell you I got everything back. I didn't. 2 years of my savings had spent their time working inside a family that never intended to return them. There were dinners I'll always remember differently now, knowing what was being planned across the table while I passed the potatoes. But I got my money back. I want to say that clearly, because I know some of you are wondering, and the people who came before me, Claudette, and however many others Noelle had managed across 30 years, never did. They signed and they lost, and they became the cautionary tale. Claudette came to Kitchener in August. We walked the trails along the Speed River, and she said something I've been thinking about ever since. The worst part wasn't the money. The worst part was being made to feel like I'd chosen to leave. Like the story of my departure was the true one. She hadn't chosen to leave. She'd been walked out, and then handed the blame for the door. When I told Maura about that, she said, "She's not the cautionary tale anymore, she's just right." That's an important distinction. Being right doesn't return the time, but it changes what the time was for. The settlement papers came in September. I signed them at my own kitchen table, alone, in the morning, with a glass of water, and the good pen I keep for documents that actually matter. I read every word before I signed. I'm careful about that now. There's a note in the margin of my grandmother's old estate file. She'd been a notary in Saskatchewan for 40 years, back when the role meant something different. She'd written it in pencil, just to herself. A signature is a promise. Read before you give it. I keep that somewhere near the part of me that knows the difference between an insurance renewal and a consent form. Some things I got back, some things I didn't. The lemon tart recipe is still good. I've made it twice since Easter, both times for people who were genuinely glad I came. That's where I am now. A little more careful each time about which tables are worth bringing something to, and a little more sure about which ones are worth leaving before the plates are cleared. They handed me a folder and told me to sign. I read it first.